We're back with one last slideshow for feudalism. Today we're going to kind of take a step away from what we've been talking about, and it's going to focus on Japanese feudalism. So starting off, the Nara period. In the 700s, Japanese emperors made Nara the capital city and became the center of government and religion. And from 700 to 800, it was known as the Nara period. Nara does still exist today, but today it's just a pretty small average town. And the thing that's most known for is its wildlife. As you can see in this picture, you can basically just hand feed deer. Nara was made to resemble a Chinese city with wide streets, large public squares, and Buddhist temples. Japanese nobles lived in large Chinese-style homes. They had wooden walls, a tile roof, polished floors, and a large garden, and many are going to resemble smaller versions of shrines. So basically, all of Japan's architecture is going to be based off of the Chinese architecture from that same time period. Emperors were organized or organizing officials into ranks based on their levels of importance. China at that time was hiring people based on their test scores. So in order to be in the Chinese government, you had to pass a test that basically said that you were smart and qualified and would do a good job in that role. Japan is going to hire people from important families, and that power will be passed down within the family. So you could basically be a complete imbecile, basically. But if you weren't from an important family, you could work in the Japanese government. And then maybe you were pretty intelligent, you were pretty bright, but maybe your children were not so bright. Maybe they were some dummies. They would basically inherit that spot that you left for them. So China is going to have qualified people in the government. Japan is just going to have wealthy or important people in the government. Top officials are going to receive large estates for their service. They were also given farmers to work the land. The emperor's power came from control of the land and the crops. Japan is going to have a census. If we remember what the census was when we were in our chapter on Rome, it was when you count all of the people in a particular country. Everyone who held or owned land had to pay taxes. Taxes at that time would include rice or silk cloth, and then all men had to serve in the army. In the year 794, the Japanese emperor will move the capital city, and this new capital is going to be Heian, which does still exist today, but today it is Kyoto. Kyoto is known for being one of the more beautiful cities in Japan and the world, with some of their gardens. And Heian is going to remain the capital city for over 1,000 years. In the 800s, the emperor's power is going to slowly begin to decline. A long line of poor rulers is going to be the cause of this. Many of these rulers were only children. So there were some instances where maybe a 5 or 10-year-old would be the emperor because their father was killed or died young, whatever it might be. So regents would govern for the children until they could do so on their own. So a regent was like a stand-in almost until that child was old enough to take over the duties themselves. However, with some of the corruption that was going on, many of the regents refused to give up the power. They might have the child put in jail, killed, or they might just reach some type of agreement where they retain the power, but they don't actually have any rights to that position. The emperor would allow nobles to stop paying taxes. In return, the nobles were responsible for governing their own lands. Nobles began to collect taxes from peasants working the land. So hopefully what you're seeing is a similar trend here to what we talked about in Europe with feudalism. The crazy part about this is that as far as any of us know, Europeans and the Japanese at this time had no communication or contact with one another. So they're essentially setting up the exact same type of government structure at the exact same time in history without having any contact with the other. In order to protect the lands and enforce the laws, nobles formed private armies. They gave land to these warriors who agreed to fight, and these warriors became known as samurai. So again, we see where there's the emperor in Japan, and then we have nobles. We obviously saw in Europe where you had kings and nobles. Then we had knights. Japan's not going to have knights, but they're going to have samurai, which is going to be the equivalent. In battle, samurais would ride on horseback with swords, daggers, bows, and arrows. Their armor was made of leather and steel, so it's going to be quite a bit different from the knights that we saw in medieval Europe. They would wear helmets with horns and crests, and their masks were designed to be terrifying. This is an example of a pretty elaborate suit of armor that a samurai might have worn. And depending on the family, the area, all of those things, the armor can look very, very different, but this is a good example of what one may have looked like. The samurai followed a code of conduct. It said they must be loyal to their master, they must be courageous, brave, and honorable. They were supposed to not care about wealth, and it was considered a huge disgrace to be captured in battle. Similar to what we saw when we discussed Sparta, when we, like at the beginning of the year when we first got started with ancient Greece. By the 1100s, powerful nobles began fighting other nobles using their armies. They were fighting for land, for power, and for glory. Finally, in 1185, the two most powerful nobles faced off. So basically, nobles just started picking off other nobles until eventually there was only two left. Minamoto Yoritomo is going to win that battle. The emperor was worried that Yoritomo is going to come after him because he had all this power. So he decided to reward him in hopes of keeping him loyal. The emperor gave Yoritomo the title of shogun. I know that word looks like shotgun without the T, but it is pronounced shogun. A shogun was the commander of all of the emperor's military forces. At this point, the emperor had no real power. The shoguns are going to run the government, which was known as a shogunate. The shoguns chose samurai to run their provinces or their states, and they were bound by their oath, which makes them great lords. The samurai would become the leading group in society during this time. We're going to see the Mongols attack. The Mongols are basically taking over all of Asia at this point. In 1274 and 1281, the Mongol leader Kublai Khan is going to send his ships and warriors to invade Japan. But both times, violent storms destroyed many ships. So it was kind of a fluke thing that we had these like typhoons basically take out most of the Mongol ships. The warriors that actually did make it to Japan were not able to defeat the samurai because they just didn't have enough men. The Japanese named these typhoons kamikazes, which mean divine wind. And you may have heard that word kamikaze before. In a few years, you will get to discuss World War II, which is where the term kamikaze is a little bit more familiar. Kamikazes were the name given to the Japanese pilots that if they got hit by gunfire, or if they were running out of fuel, instead of trying to land and be captured, they would just fly their airplanes into an area that basically had the most U.S. military personnel. So it might be a warship, it might be some type of military base, but they would basically commit suicide by trying to kill as many U.S. servicemen as possible. The samurai became resentful because after passing down their lands to their sons, the samurai had very small pieces of land. If you have 10 acres and you have to divide that 10 acres to your 5 kids, and then those 5 kids each have 2 kids, and they have to divide their land up among them, eventually that 10 acres turns into almost nothing for everyone. So in 1331, the emperor is going to rebel against the shogun with the aid of many of the samurai. The emperor won, but he could not gain control because he was not willing to give samurai more land either. So a series of weak shoguns will cause Japan to split into hundreds of different territories. So again, just like we saw in Europe, Europe split into thousands of territories. Japan is going to split into hundreds of different territories. I also realized the screen down here froze. I apologize. These territories were run by, that word is pronounced daimyo, who were powerful military lords. They pledged their loyalty to the emperor and the shogun, and they ran the lands as though they were independent. The daimyo would give the samurai much more land than the shogun had. That is the end of the slides for Japanese feudalism. The next one we'll be moving on to the Middle Ages.